The chair scraped against the floor before anyone understood what was happening. I remember that sound more than anything else, because it was the last normal sound in the room before everything changed. My name is Nora Bennett, and I was sitting 3 seats behind Ava Sullivan when Derek Holloway decided to prove a point that morning. I did not know it then, but I was about to watch something that would follow me for the rest of my life, something I would tell my own children about one day, something that would make me question everything I thought I understood about the quiet girl who sat near the window. Our classroom was not an ordinary one. It sat inside the Halden Station Academy, a school built to train students from many different worlds who had come together after the Great Alliance was formed. Some students had skin that shimmered faintly under the light. Some had eyes that could see heat instead of color. Some, like Derek, came from a species built for strength, with wide shoulders and thick bones that made them nearly twice the size of an average human. And then there were students like Ava, human, small compared to most of the others in the room, quiet, careful with her words. She kept to herself, always finishing her work early, always sitting near the window as if she needed to see the sky to feel calm. I had heard the stories about humans before I ever met one. Most of us had. The stories said humans were fragile, that their bodies broke easily, that they needed soft beds and warm blankets, and could not survive extreme heat or cold without machines to help them. Some students even laughed about it in the hallways, calling humans the gentle species, the ones who cried during films and apologized too much. Derek believed those stories more than anyone. He had made it a habit over the past few weeks to test that belief on Ava, in small and cruel ways that never seemed big enough for a teacher to notice. It started with little things. He would knock her books off her desk on his way to his seat, always pretending it was an accident. He would lean over and whisper something under his breath that made her go still for a moment before she picked her pencil back up. Once, he took her tablet during a group project and held it above his head, laughing while she reached for it, knowing she could not reach him. She never fought back. She never even raised her voice. She would simply wait, pick up whatever had fallen, and continue with her work as though nothing had happened. I used to think that was weakness. Now I know it was patience. That morning, our class was working on a shared history project, something about the early years after first contact between species. The room was noisy with conversation, tablets glowing, students moving between desks to compare notes. Professor Callahan was near the front, helping another group with a diagram, his back turned to most of the room. Derek walked past Ava's desk on his way to get materials from the shelf. I saw him slow down. I saw the small smile on his face, the one he always wore right before he did something unkind. He reached out and knocked her tablet off the desk, but this time it was not a light tap. It hit the floor hard enough that the screen cracked, a spiderweb of lines spreading across the glass. Ava looked down at it, then up at him. "That was an accident," Derek said, though his voice made it clear he did not mean it. "Pick it up," Ava said quietly. The room did not go silent yet, but a few heads turned. I turned too. There was something in her voice that did not match the girl I thought I knew. It was calm, but it was not soft. It was the kind of calm that comes right before something breaks. Derek laughed, the sound loud enough that more students looked over now. "Pick it up yourself," he said. "Or is that too hard for someone as delicate as you?" He said the word delicate the way someone spits out something they don't like the taste of. Ava did not move for a long moment. Her hands were flat on the desk, fingers spread, still. I noticed her breathing had changed, slower now, deeper, like she was preparing for something rather than reacting to it. Derek must have mistaken her stillness for fear, because he stepped closer, blocking the space between her desk and the aisle. "You know," he said, loud enough for half the class to hear, "back home, we don't let weak things slow down the strong ones. Maybe you should learn that here too." A few students laughed nervously. Others looked away, uncomfortable, but unwilling to say anything. I felt my own hands tighten around the edge of my desk, unsure of what I was supposed to do, unsure of what anyone was supposed to do. Ava finally looked up at him. Her eyes were steady, and something about the way she held herself had shifted, though I could not yet explain what it was. "You should walk away," she said. Not a threat, not a warning wrapped in anger, just a simple statement, the kind you give someone when you already know how the next few minutes are going to go, and you are giving them one last chance to avoid it. Derek did not walk away. Instead, he reached down and grabbed the strap of her bag, yanking it off the back of her chair, spilling her books and pens across the floor in front of the class. That was the moment the room finally went quiet, waiting to see what she would do. I want to be honest about something. In that moment, I still believed I knew how this would end. I believed Ava would flinch, maybe cry, maybe call for the professor, maybe simply gather her things while the class watched in second-hand embarrassment. That was the story every human student had shown us so far. Emotional, soft, non-confrontational. I was wrong, and I would spend the rest of that day, and many days after, thinking about exactly how wrong I had been. Ava stood up from her chair slowly, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not look small. Derek, still riding the confidence of his own size and strength, stepped even closer, his shadow falling over her. "What are you going to do?" he asked, grinning at the students around him, as if inviting them to enjoy the joke together. "Cry? Tell the teacher? Go ahead, I'm not scared of a human." Ava tilted her head slightly, studying him the way someone studies a puzzle they already know the answer to. "You should be," she said. The words were quiet, almost gentle, but something about the way she said them made the laughter around the room die out completely. I remember feeling a strange chill move through me, though I could not have explained why at the time. It was not fear exactly. It was the feeling of standing near something you do not yet understand, sensing that it is far bigger than it appears. Derek scoffed, shaking his head, already turning slightly toward the shelf, as if the conversation was over, as if he had already won, simply by being louder and larger. That was his mistake. He reached out one more time, not to strike her, not yet, but to shove her shoulder hard enough to push her back into her desk, the kind of casual cruelty he had gotten away with for weeks. His hand never reached her. Ava moved so quickly that for a moment I was not even sure what I had seen. 1 second his hand was reaching toward her shoulder, and the next her hand had caught his wrist, turning it at an angle that made him gasp and freeze in place, his whole body suddenly rigid. The room went utterly silent. Derek's face changed from amusement to confusion to something closer to alarm, all in the span of a heartbeat. He tried to pull his arm back, but Ava held it with a control that did not look like effort at all, as though she had done this 1,000 times before, as though her body already knew exactly where every joint bent and exactly how much pressure it could take before something gave. "I told you to walk away," she said, her voice still calm, still quiet, as if she were reminding him of something obvious rather than warning him of what was coming. I heard Professor Callahan's voice from across the room, sharp and alarmed, calling out for them to stop, but by then, it felt like the moment had already left his hands entirely. It belonged to the two of them now, to Derek and Ava, to the space between them that had been building for weeks and had finally, unavoidably, arrived. Derek, still larger, still stronger by every measurement our species used to judge such things, tried to pull free and swing his other arm toward her, perhaps out of instinct, perhaps out of wounded pride in front of the class that had just watched him lose control of the situation in an instant. What happened next unfolded so fast that many students later disagreed on the exact order of it, arguing about it in the hallways for days afterward. But I was close enough to see clearly, and I will never forget it. Ava did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She simply moved, redirecting his weight instead of matching his strength, using the force of his own swing against him in a way that made his larger body suddenly seem clumsy, almost helpless, like a machine missing a single crucial part. Within seconds, Derek was no longer standing over her. He was on the ground, and Ava stood above him, breathing steady, expression unreadable, as though she had simply finished a task rather than ended a fight. The classroom stayed frozen for a long moment, no one quite able to process what they had just witnessed. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper, barely audible, "She didn't even look angry." That was the strangest part. She hadn't. Professor Callahan finally reached them, his voice tight with urgency as he called for order, kneeling beside Derek to check if he was hurt, glancing up at Ava with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between concern and disbelief. Ava stepped back calmly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and looked down at her cracked tablet still lying on the floor where it had fallen minutes earlier. She bent down, picked it up, and sat back at her desk, as though the entire event had simply been an interruption to her morning rather than the center of it. I sat there staring at her, my mind racing through everything I thought I knew about humans, every story, every joke, every assumption whispered in hallways about how fragile and gentle they were. None of it matched what I had just seen. For weeks, we had all believed we understood exactly what humans were. Soft, emotional, easy to underestimate. In less than a minute, Ava Sullivan had quietly, calmly, and completely destroyed that idea in front of an entire classroom, without ever raising her voice, without ever losing her composure, without ever looking like she had been anything other than perfectly in control the entire time. As the room slowly filled with nervous murmurs, and Professor Callahan helped Derek to his feet, I found myself unable to look away from Ava, who had already returned to her work, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. I did not know it yet, but this was only the beginning. What I had just witnessed was not the full story. It was only the first thread pulled loose from something far larger, something that would soon reveal exactly why Ava Sullivan had never needed to raise her voice to be dangerous, and exactly why every assumption we had ever made about her kind was about to be proven wrong, again and again, in ways none of us were prepared for. Professor Callahan called for the class to settle, but settling was not something that happened easily after what we had all just seen. Derek sat in the chair the professor had guided him to, holding his wrist against his chest, his face pale in a way I had never seen on someone from his species before. His kind were known for their pride, for the way they carried themselves like nothing in the galaxy could truly touch them. Now he looked smaller than I had ever seen him, smaller even than Ava, who sat quietly at her desk with her cracked tablet in front of her, as if the entire event had already been filed away and forgotten. I could not stop looking at her. None of us could. "Ava," Professor Callahan said carefully, his voice measured, the way people speak when they are trying not to startle something they do not fully understand. "Can you explain what happened here?" She looked up at him, and for a moment her expression softened into something almost apologetic, though her eyes remained steady. "He grabbed my bag and threw my things on the floor," she said. "I asked him to stop. He didn't." "She broke my wrist," Derek said, his voice sharper now, embarrassment turning quickly into anger. "She attacked me." "You reached for her first," a voice said from the back of the room. It was Liam, a quiet boy who usually said very little in class. He rarely spoke up about anything, but his voice was firm now, unwilling to let the moment be rewritten. "Everyone saw it. You grabbed her bag, then you tried to shove her." A few other students nodded, murmuring in agreement. Even those who had laughed along with Derek earlier now seemed unwilling to defend him, as though the shock of watching him lose so quickly had stripped away whatever loyalty his size and confidence had once earned him. Professor Callahan rubbed his temple, clearly wishing this had happened during any other class period. "I need to take you both to see the administrator," he said. "Ava, please gather your things." She nodded and stood, moving with the same quiet calm she always had, as if nothing about the last several minutes had shaken her at all. As she passed my desk, I caught her eye for just a second. There was nothing cold in her expression, nothing proud or satisfied. If anything, she looked tired, the way someone looks after finishing a task they had hoped they would never have to do. The walk to the administrator's office felt like it took forever, though it was probably only a few minutes. I was not part of the group walking there, but I watched from the classroom window as they crossed the courtyard outside. Derek, walking several steps ahead, still cradling his wrist, and Ava, walking calmly behind him with Professor Callahan beside her. The rest of us were left in a classroom, buzzing with whispers the moment the door closed behind them. "Did you see that?" one student said, leaning across the aisle toward another. "She didn't even flinch." "I thought humans were supposed to be weak," someone else muttered, disbelief clear in their voice. "Maybe that was just her," another student offered, though even they did not sound convinced. I sat quietly through all of it, turning the moment over and over in my mind, trying to understand what I had actually witnessed. It was not simply that Ava had won. Plenty of unexpected outcomes happen in a moment of surprise or luck. What unsettled me was how she had won. There had been no panic in her movements, no wasted motion, no hesitation. She had moved the way someone moves when they have practiced something so many times that their body no longer needs to think about it. That kind of stillness under pressure was not something you developed by accident. I thought back to everything I had heard about humans since arriving at the academy. Their homeworld was still considered new to the wider alliance, still being studied, still being explained through cautious diplomatic reports that most students never bothered to read closely. What we knew came mostly from rumors, second-hand stories passed between students who had barely met more than one or two humans in their lives. We were taught that humans were emotional, that they formed attachments easily, that they struggled with the harsh realities of life among the stars because their world had sheltered them in comparison to species who had faced constant competition for survival. We were taught they needed protection, patience, and understanding. Nothing in what I had just seen matched a species that needed protection. At lunch that day, the story had already spread far beyond our classroom. Students from other classes stopped by our table, asking questions, wanting details, wanting to know if it was true that a human girl had taken down someone twice her size without even seeming to try. I found myself repeating the story more times than I wanted to, watching the reactions shift from disbelief to unease to something closer to fascination. It was strange, watching an entire school recalibrate its understanding of an entire species in the space of a single lunch period. "Do you think she's trained for something?" one of my friends, a girl named Elena, asked as we sat together near the courtyard windows. "Like military training, or something like that." I hadn't thought of it in those exact words yet, but the moment she said it, it felt obvious. "Maybe," I said slowly. "The way she moved didn't look like luck." "I heard humans have some of the most violent history of any species in the Alliance," another student added, lowering his voice, as though sharing something forbidden. "Not violent like uncontrolled, violent like disciplined. Like they spent thousands of years figuring out exactly how to fight efficiently." I did not know if that was true, and at the time, I had no way to confirm it, but the idea stuck with me, settling into the back of my mind like a seed waiting to grow. Ava did not return to class for the rest of that day. Neither did Derek. The administrator's office kept them both for hours, and by the time classes ended, all anyone had were rumors about what punishment might come, whether Ava would be suspended, whether Derek's family would demand some kind of formal complaint given his injury. I found myself walking home that evening, replaying the moment again and again, unable to shake the image of her calm expression as she held his wrist in place, unable to forget the complete absence of fear in her voice when she told him he should be scared. The next morning, the classroom felt different before anyone even arrived. Desks that had once been arranged casually now seemed to leave a wider gap around Ava's seat, as though everyone had silently agreed to give her more space than before. When she walked in, quiet as always, backpack over one shoulder, the room did not erupt into whispers the way I expected. Instead, it grew unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from uncertainty rather than judgment. She sat down at her desk, pulled out her tablet, now replaced with a new one, and began preparing for class as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Derek was not there. I later learned he had been moved to a different class period, whether by his own request or the administration's decision. No one seemed entirely sure. Some students said his family had been furious, demanding answers about how a human student could have caused so much damage to someone from a species known for its strength. Others said Derek himself had refused to return to the same room as Ava, unwilling to face the class after what had happened. Professor Callahan entered a few minutes later, his expression carefully neutral, though I could tell he was still processing the events of the previous day just as much as the rest of us. He began the lesson as though it were any other day, but his eyes drifted toward Ava more than once throughout the hour, as if he too was trying to reconcile the quiet, attentive student in front of him with the calm, controlled figure who had ended a fight in seconds without breaking a sweat. During a short break between lessons, I finally worked up the courage to approach her desk. I was not sure what I wanted to say, only that I felt compelled to say something, to understand even a fraction of what I had witnessed. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She looked up at me, and for a moment, her expression was simply tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you for asking." I hesitated, unsure how far to push. "Where did you learn to do that?" I finally asked. "What you did yesterday. It didn't look like something you just figured out in the moment." Something flickered across her face, there and gone so quickly I almost missed it. It was not anger, and it was not pride. It looked, if anything, like memory, like the shadow of something she did not often speak about. "Where I'm from," she said slowly, "you learn certain things early, not because you want to, because you have to." I wanted to ask more, but the bell rang, and the moment passed as quickly as it had come. She gathered her things and moved to her next class, leaving me standing there with more questions than I had started with. Over the following days, the story of what happened in our classroom continued to spread, growing slightly with each retelling, though the core of it never changed. A human girl had ended a fight with someone twice her size in seconds, without ever raising her voice, without ever losing control. What none of us knew yet, what I would only begin to understand in the weeks that followed, was that this moment was not an isolated event. It was the first visible sign of something much larger, something connected to the history of an entire species that most of the Alliance had never truly taken the time to understand. Humans were not simply capable of controlled, efficient defense when pushed into a corner. They were shaped by it, built by centuries of conflict and struggle that most other species in the Alliance had never experienced in the same way. I did not know it yet, but Ava Sullivan was about to become the reason an entire academy, and eventually, much more than that, would be forced to reconsider everything they thought they understood about the quiet, gentle species called humanity. It was almost a week later when I finally learned the full story, and it came from a place I never expected. The Academy held a mandatory assembly that Friday, one of those long gatherings where the administrator speaks about conduct and expectations while most students quietly wait for it to end. This time, however, the topic was different. This time, the entire hall was filled with a tension that had not existed before Ava Sullivan calmly ended a fight in front of an entire class. Administrator Voss stood at the front of the hall, a tall figure from a species known for measured, careful speech, the kind of voice that could calm an angry room simply through tone alone. Beside her stood Professor Callahan, and near the side of the stage, looking uncomfortable in a way I had never seen him before, stood Derek, his wrist still wrapped, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "There has been an incident in one of our classrooms," Administrator Voss began, her voice carrying easily across the hall without needing to be raised. "I want to address it directly, rather than allow rumors to continue shaping the narrative." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd before settling. "A student was physically confronted by a classmate," she continued. "In defending herself, she caused injury to the student who initiated the confrontation. After reviewing the full record of the classroom, including testimony from multiple witnesses, the administration has concluded that the response, while forceful, was a direct result of repeated provocation that had gone unaddressed for several weeks. I glanced toward Derek, whose shoulders seemed to sink further with every word. "This is a reminder to all students," Administrator Voss said, her gaze sweeping across the hall, "that every species represented at this academy carries its own history, its own strengths, and its own capacity for defense. It would be a mistake, and I say this plainly, to assume weakness simply because a species presents itself with patience and restraint." The words settled over the hall like something heavy. I noticed several students shifting in their seats, glancing toward each other, glancing toward Ava, who sat near the middle of the room, her expression calm as always, though I could tell she wished she were anywhere else. After the assembly ended and students filed out into the courtyard, I found myself walking beside Elena, both of us quiet for a while before she finally spoke. "Do you think there's more to it?" she asked, the way the administrator talked about it. It sounded like she knew something about humans that most of us don't. I had been wondering the same thing. That evening, driven by a curiosity I could not quite explain, I decided to look into the public records the Academy kept about partner species in the Alliance, hoping to find something that might explain what I had witnessed. Most of what I found was exactly what I expected. General information about human history, their homeworld, their culture, all written in careful diplomatic language meant for students who had never actually met one. But buried within a section about early Alliance relations, I found a passage that stopped me completely. It described humanity as a species that had endured an unusually long period of internal conflict throughout its history, long before ever making contact with other worlds. Where many species in the Alliance had achieved unity relatively early in their development, avoiding centuries of large-scale conflict between their own populations, humans had not. Their history was filled with periods of struggle, competition, and survival that had shaped not only their societies, but their very physiology and instincts. The passage explained, in careful and measured language, that this history had left humans with reflexes and physical capabilities uniquely suited to close combat situations, something most species in the Alliance had never needed to develop to the same degree. It was not a matter of strength alone. It was precision, adaptability, and an instinct for reading an opponent's movement that came from generations of necessity rather than simple physical training. I sat back from my desk, letting the information settle in my mind. It explained so much about what I had witnessed in the classroom, yet it also raised even more questions. If this was simply a natural part of human history, then what had shaped Ava specifically? Where had she learned to move with such controlled precision, the kind of skill that seemed less like instinct and more like discipline? I got part of my answer a few days later, though not in the way I expected. It happened during one of our training exercises, a simulated scenario meant to test coordination and teamwork among students from different species. We were divided into small groups and given a series of physical and strategic challenges to complete together. Everything from navigating obstacle courses to solving coordination puzzles that required quick thinking under pressure. Ava was placed in a group with several students who had clearly heard the stories but had not yet seen anything themselves. Among them was a student named Owen, broad-shouldered and confident, from a species known for competitive physical challenges. I was in a nearby group, close enough to watch as the exercise unfolded. The challenge required each group to navigate a series of moving obstacles while carrying a weighted object between them, a test of both physical capability and teamwork. Owen, eager to prove himself after hearing about Derek's defeat, took charge of the group almost immediately, directing everyone with the confidence of someone who assumed his physical strength alone would carry them through. "Just follow my lead," he said, glancing toward Ava with something between curiosity and challenge in his eyes. "I've done exercises like this before. It's mostly about strength and timing." Ava nodded calmly, saying little, allowing him to lead, as the group began moving through the obstacles. What struck me, watching from a distance, was how quickly the dynamic shifted once the challenge became difficult. Where Owen relied on raw strength to push through obstacles, often losing balance or timing in the process, Ava adjusted almost instantly, finding smaller, more efficient movements that conserved energy while keeping the group steady. By the third obstacle, it was clear who was actually leading the group, even though no one had officially changed roles. Ava's quiet suggestions, offered without any hint of arrogance, began shaping how the team moved. She would point out a shift in balance before it became a problem, suggest a change in grip before someone lost their footing, anticipate where the next obstacle would require a change in pace before it even became visible. By the end of the exercise, Owen was breathing heavily, clearly exhausted, while Ava looked barely affected, her breathing steady, her expression calm and focused as it always seemed to be. "How did you know we needed to shift there?" Owen asked afterward, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier bravado. Ava shrugged slightly. "You get used to reading small changes," she said simply. "It becomes automatic after a while." "Reading changes in what?" he pressed. She paused for a moment, and I watched her expression carefully, the way it had shifted, the same way it had when I asked her a similar question days earlier. "In people," she said finally, "in situations. You learn to notice when something is about to go wrong before it actually does." It was such a simple answer, yet it carried a weight that made the whole group go quiet for a moment. Later that day, during a brief period between classes, I finally found myself alone with Ava near the courtyard, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the open space. I had been turning over the information I had found in the Academy's records, along with everything I had witnessed since the day of the fight, and I finally decided to ask her directly. "Can I ask you something?" I said, sitting down near her on one of the courtyard benches. She looked up from her tablet, studying me for a moment, before nodding. "Go ahead." "The records here say humans have a history of conflict, more than most species in the Alliance," I said carefully. "Is that why you knew how to do what you did? Is that just something all humans learn?" Ava was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting toward the horizon where the station's artificial sky was beginning to shift into the soft colors of a simulated evening. "Not all humans," she said finally. "But where I grew up, yes. You learn things early there. Not because it's exciting, not because it's fun, because if you don't get the chance to grow up at all." Her voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it now, something heavier than the words themselves. "I grew up in a place that most people don't talk about much," she continued. "A region back home that saw a lot of conflict long after the rest of the world had mostly settled into peace. My family didn't have much choice but to learn how to protect ourselves. My mother taught me before I even understood why it mattered." I sat quietly, letting her continue at her own pace, sensing that pushing too hard would only close the door she had just opened. "By the time I came here," she said, "it wasn't something I thought about anymore. It was just part of how I moved through the world. I didn't expect to ever need it again. I thought coming to a place like this, with so many different species working together, meant I could finally leave that part of my life behind." She paused, glancing down at her hands. "I didn't want what happened with Derek to happen," she said quietly. "I tried to avoid it for weeks. I hoped it would just stop on its own, but some things don't stop unless you make them stop." I thought about everything I had witnessed since that day, the calm certainty in her movements, the complete absence of panic even as Derek towered over her, the quiet control in every choice she made throughout the confrontation. "Do you regret it?" I asked softly. She considered the question carefully before answering. "No," she said, "I regret that it had to happen at all, but I don't regret protecting myself." We sat in silence for a while after that, the courtyard slowly filling with the sounds of other students moving between classes, the moment settling into something quieter and more thoughtful than the chaos of the days before. What I did not know yet, sitting there beside her in the fading light, was that the story was far from over. Derek's family, humiliated by what they saw as a public defeat, was preparing to challenge the administration's decision. And somewhere within that challenge, a new confrontation was already beginning to take shape, one that would test not just Ava's skill, but everything the Academy, and eventually the wider alliance, thought they understood about the quiet strength of humanity. The challenge came exactly 1 week later, delivered not through whispers or rumors this time, but through a formal notice posted on the Academy's public board, visible to every student who passed through the main hall that morning. I remember standing in front of it with a small crowd already gathered, reading the words twice before I fully understood what they meant. Derek's family, embarrassed by what they saw as a humiliating defeat in front of witnesses, had invoked an old Academy tradition rarely used in recent years, something called a formal resolution match. It allowed two students involved in a serious conflict to settle the matter through a supervised, sanctioned exercise, monitored closely by instructors and medical staff, rather than leaving the matter to informal rumors and lingering tension. The notice listed both names clearly: Derek Holloway, Ava Sullivan. "They can't be serious," Elena said beside me, her voice tight with disbelief. She already ended it once. Why would they want to go through that again? "Pride," I said quietly, though even as I said it, I wasn't entirely sure that was the full reason. By midday, the news had spread through every corner of the Academy. Students who had barely spoken about the original incident were suddenly discussing strategy, discussing odds, discussing whether what happened in the classroom had truly been a fair reflection of what Ava could do, or simply a lucky moment that Derek's family refused to accept as final. I found Ava during a break between classes, sitting quietly near the same courtyard bench where we had spoken the week before. She was staring down at her tablet, though I could tell she wasn't really reading anything on the screen. "You saw the notice," I said, sitting down beside her. She nodded slowly. "I saw it. Are you going to accept it?" She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I don't think I have much choice," she said. "If I refuse, it will be seen as an admission that what happened before wasn't real, that maybe I got lucky. That would only make things worse, not better." "Are you worried?" I asked. She considered the question carefully, the same way she seemed to consider everything, weighing it before responding. "Not about the match itself," she said. "I'm worried about what it means, about what people expect it to prove." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time, but I would come to understand it clearly in the days that followed. Professor Callahan met with Ava privately that afternoon, and though I wasn't present for the conversation, Elena, who had a class nearby, told me she saw Ava leaving his office looking calm but distracted, the kind of distracted that comes from carrying a decision rather than uncertainty about what to do. Over the following days, the Academy prepared for the match with unusual formality. A supervised training space was arranged, medical staff were placed on standby, and instructors from multiple departments were assigned to oversee the exercise to ensure it remained controlled and safe. It was clear that the administration wanted this to be handled with far more structure than the spontaneous encounter in the classroom. Derek, for his part, seemed to use the days leading up to the match as an opportunity to rebuild his confidence. I saw him in the training yard several times that week, working with an instructor from his own species, practicing movements that emphasized his natural strength and size. Word spread that his family had even arranged additional coaching, unwilling to let their reputation rest on what they still insisted had been an unfair surprise rather than a genuine loss. "He's taking this seriously," Elena said one afternoon as we watched him from a distance, moving through a series of drills with clear determination. "Maybe too seriously." I thought about that a lot in the days that followed. Derek was no longer underestimating Ava the way he had before. If anything, the humiliation of his first defeat seemed to have sharpened his focus into something far more dangerous, an eagerness not just to win, but to prove that his first loss had been an anomaly rather than a true reflection of what would happen between them. Ava, meanwhile, did not train publicly the way Derek did. She continued attending her classes as usual, calm and composed, giving no outward sign of preparation or anxiety. It was only during one quiet evening, when I happened to walk past one of the smaller training rooms near the edge of the academy grounds, that I finally understood how she was preparing. Through the narrow window of the door, I saw her alone in the room, moving slowly and deliberately through a series of motions I did not recognize, each movement precise and controlled, repeated again and again with the kind of patience that comes from years of practice rather than sudden effort. There was no anger in her movements, no aggression. It looked almost like a quiet conversation between her body and the empty space around her, each motion flowing into the next with a calm that felt entirely different from Derek's intense, forceful drills. I did not disturb her. I simply watched for a moment longer before continuing on my way, carrying with me a growing understanding that whatever was about to happen between them would not be a simple repeat of what had occurred in the classroom. The night before the match, the academy felt unusually still. Even the hallways, normally filled with late evening conversation and laughter, carried a quieter energy, as though the entire student body understood, without needing to say it aloud, that tomorrow would settle something far larger than a disagreement between two classmates. I found myself unable to sleep, replaying everything I had learned over the past 2 weeks. The history hidden in the academy's records, the quiet strength beneath Ava's calm exterior, the careful, controlled way she moved through every challenge, never wasting energy, never acting without purpose. I thought about what she had told me in the courtyard, about learning to protect herself not out of excitement, but out of necessity. I thought about the weight in her voice when she said she had hoped to leave that part of her life behind after coming to the academy. And I thought about Derek, driven now not by simple arrogance, but by a genuine need to reclaim something he felt had been taken from him in front of the entire class. Neither of them, I realized, was approaching tomorrow lightly. And that, more than anything else, made me deeply uncertain about what the outcome would truly reveal. The morning of the match arrived with a tension that seemed to hang over the entire academy like a held breath. Classes were adjusted to allow students to gather in the training hall, where a wide circular space had been prepared, surrounded by observation seating and monitored closely by instructors positioned at every angle. I found a seat near the front with Elena and Liam, all three of us quiet as the hall slowly filled around us. Whispers rippled through the crowd, students exchanging predictions and theories, some still convinced that Derek's size and strength would ultimately overwhelm Ava in a more structured, prepared setting, others recalling the calm precision of her movements during the first encounter and refusing to underestimate her again. Administrator Voss stood near the edge of the circle, flanked by Professor Callahan and 2 medical staff members, their presence a clear reminder that this was meant to be a controlled exercise, not a repeat of the chaotic outburst from weeks earlier. "This match will be conducted under strict supervision," Administrator Voss announced, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. "The purpose is not to determine dominance between species, but to allow both students a fair, structured opportunity to resolve the conflict that began between them. Any excessive force will result in immediate intervention." The crowd quieted as Derek entered from one side of the hall, his posture straighter than I had seen it in weeks, his expression focused and determined rather than arrogant. Whatever confidence had been shaken during the classroom incident had clearly been rebuilt into something steadier, something more calculated. A moment later, Ava entered from the opposite side, calm as always, her expression unreadable as she stepped into the circle and faced him from across the open space. The hall fell completely silent. I glanced at Elena beside me, and she glanced back, both of us sharing the same unspoken thought. Whatever was about to happen in the next few minutes would not simply settle a disagreement between 2 classmates. It would answer a question that had been quietly forming in the minds of every student at the academy since the day Ava Sullivan had ended a fight in class without ever raising her voice. Was that moment truly who she was, or only the beginning of something far greater than any of us had yet understood? Administrator Voss raised her hand, signaling both students to prepare, the tension in the hall thick enough that I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. And then, with a single quiet word, the match began. For the first few seconds, neither of them moved. Derek circled slowly, his eyes fixed on Ava with the kind of focus I had never seen from him before, none of the careless confidence that had defined him in the classroom weeks earlier. Ava stood still at the center of the circle, her weight balanced evenly, her arms relaxed at her sides, watching him with the same calm patience she carried into everything she did. The silence stretched long enough that a few students in the crowd began to whisper, wondering if either of them would make the first move. Then Derek shifted his stance, testing the distance between them with a quick step forward, gauging her reaction. Ava did not flinch. She adjusted her position slightly, small enough that most of the crowd probably missed it, but I had watched her closely enough over the past 2 weeks to recognize it for what it was. She was reading him, the same way she had read the obstacles during the training exercise, the same way she had read Derek's first careless swing in the classroom. He moved first, a controlled step followed by a reaching motion meant to close the distance and gain control of the space between them. It was nothing like the wild, careless shove from weeks earlier. This was practiced, deliberate, clearly shaped by days of coaching meant to correct the mistakes that had cost him before. Ava shifted just enough to avoid the full force of his approach, redirecting the motion with a small, efficient movement of her own, using the space he had tried to close against him rather than meeting it head-on. It was not the sudden, decisive end that had shocked the classroom weeks earlier. This time, Derek recovered quickly, adjusting his balance and turning to face her again, clearly prepared for the possibility that she would try something similar. He learned, Liam whispered beside me, watching intently. He had. That much was clear from the way Derek moved now, more careful, more measured, no longer relying purely on size and confidence to carry him through. For a moment, I wondered if the outcome of this match might truly be different from what had happened before. The two of them exchanged a series of careful movements over the next several minutes, testing each other's reactions, searching for openings, neither willing to commit fully to an approach that might leave them exposed. Derek used his size to control space, forcing Ava to remain constantly aware of the boundaries of the circle, limiting the room she had to work with. Ava, in turn, used precision and timing, conserving her energy while waiting for the right moment rather than forcing an opening before it existed. It was strange, watching them like this. There was an intensity to the match that had been missing from the sudden chaos of the classroom encounter, but there was also something else, something almost respectful in the way they studied each other now, each fully aware of what the other was capable of. The turning point came almost 15 minutes into the match, longer than anyone in the crowd had expected. Derek, growing frustrated with his inability to close the gap effectively, shifted his strategy, attempting a broader, more committed approach meant to overwhelm Ava through sheer momentum rather than careful positioning. It was a calculated risk, and for a brief moment it seemed to work. He managed to close the distance fully, forcing Ava back toward the edge of the circle, using his size to limit her options in a way he had not managed earlier in the match. The crowd leaned forward, a wave of tension rippling through the hall as it seemed, for just a moment, that the outcome might finally shift in his favor. But Ava did not panic, even with her back nearly at the boundary of the circle. She waited, watching his final approach with the same calm patience she had carried since the beginning, and in the instant he committed fully to his advance, she moved. It was not a large motion, it did not need to be. She shifted her weight low and redirected his forward momentum along a new path, using the very force he had built up against him rather than trying to stop it outright. Derek's balance broke instantly, his own strength turned against him in a way that left him stumbling forward past her rather than through her. Before he could fully recover, Ava had already repositioned, controlling the space between them once more, calm and composed, even as the crowd gasped at the sudden shift. Derek turned quickly, clearly frustrated, and made one final attempt, a controlled strike meant to catch her off guard before she could reset her position fully. It was the last mistake he made. Ava caught his arm mid-motion, redirecting it with the same careful precision she had shown from the very beginning, using a controlled hold that brought the match to an immediate stop without causing further harm. Derek froze, unable to continue without risking injury, and after a tense moment of silence, Administrator Voss stepped forward. "The match is concluded," she announced, her voice calm but firm. "Ava Sullivan has demonstrated control of the exchange." The hall remained silent for a long moment before the weight of what had just happened settled fully over the crowd. This had not been a sudden, unexpected outburst like the classroom incident. This had been a structured, supervised match, with Derek fully prepared, fully trained, and fully aware of what he was facing. And still, the outcome had been the same. Ava released his arm carefully, stepping back with the same calm composure she had carried throughout the entire match. Derek stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something quieter, something closer to grudging understanding. "How?" he said, his voice low, meant only for her, though I was close enough to hear it. "I trained. I prepared. How did you still make it look so easy?" Ava studied him for a moment before answering, her voice calm and without any trace of pride. "It's not about strength," she said. "It never was. It's about patience, about waiting for the right moment instead of forcing one that isn't there yet." Derek looked down for a long moment, and when he looked back up, something in his expression had shifted. It was not anger anymore. It was something closer to respect, hard-won and unwilling, but genuine. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words clearly difficult for him, "for all of it, the weeks before, today, all of it." Ava nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "I hope we can move past it." The crowd began to murmur again, though the tone had shifted entirely from what it had been before the match began. Where there had once been disbelief and skepticism, there was now a quiet, growing understanding that what happened in the classroom weeks earlier had not been an isolated moment of luck. It had been a genuine reflection of exactly who Ava Sullivan was, and by extension, a small glimpse into the deeper history of an entire species that most of the Alliance had barely taken the time to understand. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at the Academy changed in ways I could not have predicted. Students who had once dismissed humans as gentle and fragile now spoke of them with a cautious curiosity, eager to understand more about a history most of the Alliance had overlooked for far too long. Instructors began incorporating more detailed lessons about human history into the curriculum, moving beyond the brief, careful summaries that had shaped most of our previous understanding. Derek, surprisingly, became one of the more vocal advocates for this shift. He approached Ava several times over the following weeks, not with challenge or resentment, but with genuine curiosity, asking about her training, about her homeworld, about the history that had shaped the calm, controlled strength she carried so quietly. I found myself thinking often about the moment I first realized how wrong I had been about humans, standing frozen in that classroom weeks earlier as Ava calmly ended a fight that Derek himself had started. At the time, it had felt like nothing more than a shocking surprise, a single unexpected moment that would fade into memory as the weeks passed. Instead, it had become something far larger, a quiet reminder that assumptions built on incomplete understanding could crumble in an instant, revealing truths far more complex than the surface ever suggested. One evening, weeks after the formal match, I found myself sitting once again beside Ava in the courtyard, the artificial sky above us settling into the familiar colors of a peaceful evening. "Do you think it will keep happening?" I asked. "People underestimating humans, I mean." She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Probably," she said. "It's easier to believe something simple than to understand something complicated. But maybe, little by little, that will change." "Because of what happened here?" I asked. She shook her head slightly. "Not just here," she said. "This kind of thing has probably happened in a lot of places, a lot of times. Every time someone underestimates something they don't fully understand, they learn eventually. Sometimes the lesson is small, sometimes it isn't." I thought about that for a long time after our conversation ended, turning her words over in my mind as the academy settled into its usual rhythm around us. Humanity, I had come to understand, was not simply a gentle species hiding behind soft words and careful patience. It was a species shaped by struggle, by history, by centuries of learning exactly how far restraint could be pushed before it became something else entirely. Ava Sullivan never sought attention for what happened in that classroom, and she never sought it after the formal match either. She continued her studies quietly, calmly, exactly as she had before any of it began, carrying herself with the same patient composure that had first made me underestimate her entirely. But every student who had witnessed what happened that day carried something different with them now, a quiet understanding that the calm, patient students in any room might be carrying far more strength than anyone realized, simply choosing, again and again, not to show it unless they truly had no other choice. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I understood something else too, something that would stay with me long after I left that academy behind. Humanity had not been holding back out of weakness all along. They had simply been waiting,